Sarah and Jason had been friends for years, always on the lookout for a new adventure. When they learned about Ashford Cemetery, they couldn't resist the temptation. It was an old, isolated graveyard tucked deep into the woods where few ventured. The local legend surrounding it was enough to spark their curiosity. They had heard whispers about the undead spirits that haunted the cemetery. Angry souls who had been buried under suspicious circumstances, their restless spirits rising every night to seek vengeance. But the real kicker was the claim that a wraith wandered the graveyard at night, drawn to those who dared disturb the peace of the dead. Whispers told of people disappearing without a trace, their names forever etched into the crumbling gravestones, but with no body ever found. Local residents said they could sometimes hear faint cries from the cemetery late at night, but no one ever dared to investigate. Jason, being the skeptic he was, scoffed at the idea of a wraith. "It's just a cemetery, Sarah. Ghost stories, that's all. We're just going to check it out, take some photos and leave." Sarah wasn't so sure, but her curiosity got the better of her. She agreed to go with him. As they made their way through the dense woods, the sun dipped lower and lower, casting long shadows across the trail. The air grew thick, and a sense of unease settled over them. The further they walked, the quieter the woods became, until even the sound of their footsteps seemed to fade into the ominous silence. Soon the graveyard came into view, and they both stopped dead in their tracks. Ashford Cemetery was unlike any graveyard they had ever seen. The stone gates were weathered and broken, the iron fence twisted in strange shapes, and the tombstones leaned at odd angles, some completely shattered. The trees surrounding the cemetery seemed to have a dark, knotted appearance, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. Jason scoffed. "This place is messed up, but it's just an old graveyard. Let's get some pictures and head back." Sarah hesitated. There was something off about the place, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. But she pushed her fears aside, reminding herself it was all just a story. They crossed the gates and stepped into the cemetery, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of dead leaves beneath them. They wandered deeper into the graveyard, their flashlights illuminating rows upon rows of aged graves, some of the names worn away by time. It wasn't long before they found themselves near a secluded section of the cemetery, where the oldest graves lay. The gravestones here were different, rough-hewn, with symbols that seemed strange and ancient, like they had been placed by people who had long since disappeared. As they explored, Sarah felt a cold gust of wind sweep through the cemetery. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling a chill that went deeper than just the temperature. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Hey, Jason," she said, her voice shaking. "Let's head back, okay?" But Jason didn't answer. He was staring at something in the distance, his face pale. "Sarah, look at that." Following his gaze, Sarah's heart skipped a beat. In the distance, standing among the graves, was a figure. It was tall, cloaked in a tattered black robe, its face obscured by a shadow. It stood perfectly still, watching them. The air around it seemed to shimmer, like the figure wasn't entirely solid, as if it were made of the very night itself. "It's just a trick of the light," Jason said, though his voice trembled with doubt. Probably some prankster. But Sarah knew better. That figure wasn't just a trick, there was something deeply wrong about it. Before they could make a move, the wind suddenly picked up and the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift. The cemetery itself seemed to groan, as though the earth were waking from a long slumber. The tombstones rattled, and Sarah's flashlight flickered, casting strange, elongated shadows across the graves. And then the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, it began to glide toward them. No footsteps, no sound, just an unnatural movement, like the air itself was carrying it. Jason and Sarah froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. They wanted to run, but their legs felt like they were rooted to the ground, as if the cemetery itself were holding them there. The figure stopped just a few feet away from them. A low, inhuman whisper filled the air, a voice that seemed to come from all around them. "Leave!" It was the only word, but it was enough to send a wave of panic through them. Jason tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. His breath came in shallow gasps, his vision blurring. "Run!" Sarah screamed, grabbing his arm and pulling him in the opposite direction. They tore through the cemetery, dodging gravestones and tangled roots as they sprinted for the gates. But the figure was still there, gliding after them, its shadow growing larger with every step they took. The whispering voice followed them, getting louder, more insistent. "Leave, now!" Finally, they reached the gates, and with one final, desperate push, they stumbled out of the cemetery. They didn't stop running until they reached the safety of the road. When they looked back, the cemetery was silent, its gates closed, its shadows dark, as though nothing had ever happened. They never spoke of that night again, but they both knew what they had seen. The Wraith was real, and it would never leave Ashford Cemetery. The souls trapped within those graves were still restless, waiting for anyone foolish enough to disturb their peace. And have you ever found yourself hopelessly lost, confused, and feeling like you were being watched? Beware. There are terrifying and mysterious beings that few have ever seen and lived to talk about. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and follow us for more. Join us on TikTok and YouTube for more bone-chilling chronicles, if you dare.